Perfect. So it looks like we're live and it looks like we have people streaming in. So we've just opened up the webcast about a minute before the webinar, just to allow everyone to stream in. See, there's already 200 people in the room, and I see many familiar names. So it's amazing that you're all able to join so far. I know we have over 550 property managers registered to attend today's webinar. So we're just going to give it a minute to make sure that managers have an opportunity to join this webinar. And while we're doing that, I'll just say hi to some of the names that we see there. So perfect. So hi, Khalid. Eleonora. Hi, Lorianne. Oh, and Lori Patrick Clark. Hello, how are you? Sonia, good morning. Harvin. Harvin, we need to get you on one of these webinars as well soon. Hi, Raina. So we're just gonna give it about 30 more seconds to make sure um, managers have an opportunity to log in. Currently, we're approaching 300. So once it hits 11:01, we'll kick off this webinar. So thank you, everyone, for your patience. See Michaela's there, Michelle Joy, one of our favorites. See a lot of names there. Perfect. So it is 11:01 now, so we will kick off this webinar. And as you see, this webinar is entitled What's the Real Cost? Condo Fee Trends in 2026. And during this webinar, we will go through our 2026 condo fee trends report, which we released last week. And then after going through the 2026 condo fee trends report, we will have a panel discussion with the experts you see right there. And with that, maybe I'll give an introduction. I'll start with the introduction. So, the first panelist, who I'll introduce, is Tracy, and Tracy Hernandez. She was actually one of the first clients we ever worked with, and that's going back, I think, 5 years now.
Yeah.
And yeah, while Condonexus has grown a lot since that time, so has Tracy. She's now a district manager at Dell, and she brings over a decade of hands-on condominium experience. She works with boards every day, and she has a really strong pulse on what's actually happening on the ground, especially when it comes to things like budgets, owners' expectations, and managing change. So we're really glad to have her joining us here today, and this is actually her first time with us. So welcome, Tracy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anthony.
No worries. And our second guest is Luis Hernandez, and Luis is from LDDC Lawyers, which is short for Levitt, Delela, Duggan, and Chaplick LLP. And Luis is a very familiar face to many of you here. He's a regular panelist at webinars, including many of the ones we've hosted in the past, as well as industry seminars. And we also see him very often in the virtual AGMs that we host, where he frequently acts as a chairperson and helps to guide meetings through some very complex discussions. He is one of the best in the condo space, and we're really glad to have him here today. So, welcome, Luis.
Thanks, Anthony. Always glad to be here, and you always make me blush at the beginning with these intros.
We're glad to have you here as well. And finally, our third guest is Jan Kundakci from Adams and Miles. And Jan brings over 2 decades of experience in condominium auditing, and he is widely regarded as a thought leader in the space. I actually ran into Jan recently at the CCI luncheon, the Christmas luncheon, where he was speaking on a panel, sharing his insights with property managers. And our team has probably run into him hundreds of times through our virtual AGMs that we host, where he's always generously sharing his time and knowledge with owners. So we're really glad to have you with us today as well, Jan. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here and really looking forward to it. I think this is a very important one, and I'm glad we have such a good number of people turn out.
Yeah, absolutely. And my name is Anthony Ng, as some of you may know, and I am the co-founder of Condonexus. And as some of you may know, Condonexus is a digital proxy voting, electronic budget delivery, and virtual and hybrid meeting provider for condos across Ontario. We're currently trusted by nearly 1,300 condos, which is approximately 1 in 10 condos in Ontario. As mentioned in previous CPE webinars, an important part of what we do is help managers be productive at work and help managers look brilliant before their owners and their boards. So that's why we also hold these CPE webinars. So as you see on the screen right there, this is a CPE webinar. It is eligible for 1.0 CPE credits. So after this webinar, sometime in the afternoon, not immediately after, we will be sending you a certificate of completion. So if you are a general licensed manager, you're welcome to submit that into the CMRA portal for 1.0 CPE credits. So I guess jumping in, we will start off with a presentation of our Condonexus's 2026 condo fee trends report. And then after we're done this, we will jump into a panel discussion with our three expert guests. And I always like to encourage everyone, if you do have any questions, please feel free to type it into the Q&A window just by clicking the Q&A button. If we have time at the end of the webinar, we would love to answer any questions that may arise. So the report that you see on the screen right there that we'll be going through was released a week ago, and you can find it on our website, condonexus.com. I'll share a link with everyone in the chat just a bit later. So I'm going to walk everyone through the key findings from this year's condo fee trends report. This is actually our fourth year doing this, and the goal with this report has always been the same. We want to give boards and managers a clearer, a more grounded picture of what's actually driving condo fees, like beyond just the simple headlines or the gut reactions that people sometimes get when they see their condo fee cover letters, for example. So this year's report is actually based on over 150 condo budgets across Ontario. And this is covering everything from newer builds to buildings that are over 50 years old, spanning Toronto, Peel, York, Halton, and the Durham region. And these condos represent more than $340 million in operating budget. So, going into the report, let's just start off with the bigger picture, let's say. So in 2025, we saw that condo fees increased on average by about 4.3% across the condos that we analyze. And that's slightly higher than last year, but it's still relatively moderate, especially compared to some of those years during the pandemic, like in 2022, when fees increased by, on average, nearly 7%. What's important here is actually what's driving these fee increases. And as you'll see in this report, it's not really a case of everything going up at once. It's really more of a story of offsetting pressures this year. So there are what you'll see is that there will be some categories like gas and insurance that actually went down, and then you'll see that there are other categories like reserve fund contributions and labor related costs that actually continued to rise. And then, in fact, that's actually sort of been the consistent theme over the past few years. So even as some costs ease, others sort of quickly fill that gap. So the challenge for boards is that, owners, they sort of feel the net increase, but they don't feel the nuance behind it. So this report aims to share some of that nuance so that property managers can communicate that nuance to their boards. So the next slide is about reserve fund contributions, and reserve fund contribution increases continue to be high. So as you can see in 2025, reserve fund contributions increased by 11.4% on average. And as you can see, that marks 3 consecutive years of double-digit increases. And in fact, even if you average out the last 4 years, that there might be a double-digit increase in terms of the compounded annual growth rate of the reserve fund contributions. And this is essentially where a lot of the pressure on condo fees is really coming from. And what's interesting to see, if we zoom into this table down here, this table here is actually the Ontario Residential Building Construction Price Composite. And what you'll see is that over the last year, as of Q2 2025, residential building construction prices only increased by about 1.8% on average. However, a lot of the damage has already been done, as everyone here knows, because over the last 5 years, residential building construction prices in Ontario have increased by over 75%. Let me just zoom out again. Um, Reserve fund contributions, therefore, are still rising sharply, and we believe a lot of that is due to a lagged effect. And by a lagged effect, what I essentially mean is reserve fund studies are still catching up to reality. So as replacement costs are still much higher than what they were in the pre-pandemic years, reserve fund studies are still catching up to that. And then on top of that, there's a lot of anecdotes about many condos were actually very underfunded in the years before that. So a lot of reserve funds are catching up to that, increasing their contributions just to really ensure that they can finance and fund those major repairs and replacements in the years and decades ahead. I think the big challenge with this number is when reserve fund contributions generally make up more than 25% of a condo's budget, even a small change in reserve fund contributions can lead to an increase in a significant increase in maintenance fees overall. But a large increase to this large part of the pie in a budget is going to lead to a large increase in condo fees. Yeah, this is a major contributor to condo fee increases in Ontario. So the next slide I have here is about gas costs. So gas costs have trended back towards lower levels, and this is one of the few areas where we saw some meaningful relief. So gas costs declined by about 9% following 2 years of increases. And the sun is blaring into my room right now, which is why you see a lot of exposure. So I apologize for that, but hopefully that sun will pass by shortly. Um, but yeah, gas costs declined by about 9% in 2025, following 2 years of major increases in 2022 and 2023 as conflicts overseas really roiled the gas markets in those years. The decrease in gas costs in 2025 were really driven by two things mainly. One is lower gas commodity prices. So, as you can see in the graph down here below, you can see that the historical natural gas price declined from a peak of about 28 cents per cubic meter in 2022 back to a more regular rate of about 10 cents per cubic meter in more recent years. On top of that, last year we also saw the removal of the carbon tax component. Basically, that carbon tax made up about 20% of gas costs. So with that being gone, we did see a substantial decrease in gas costs for condos. But you guys might be wondering again, we saw gas prices increase by over 40% in these 2 years. Why have they not come down by more than that? Part of it might be a bit of a lagged effect, as some of those budgets may not have accounted for things like the carbon tax being taken off the tables. But the other thing also is it's important to remember that gas costs for a condo isn't just the price of gas itself, but there are certain things like delivery, transportation, and fixed charges that still make up a very large part of the bill. And we haven't seen those components of the gas bill decline nearly as much. So while the decrease in gas prices has helped offset costs in 2025, I think that boards should assume that this decrease will not be continuing forever. But it is nice to see gas prices trending back down after some major increases in past years. So the next slide I have here is on electricity costs. So this is actually the first year that we've started tracking electricity prices in our report. And in 2025, we saw electricity costs rise by about 3.7%, following a 5% increase the year before. Historically, electricity has been relatively stable, but we are starting to see that's starting to change. We are seeing a bit more volatility. The graph down here shows the electric power selling price index, and this shows the prices that distributors are selling to commercial and industrial users, and we are seeing a bit more volatility in these rates. And while they aren't necessarily trending upwards per se, there's a lot more spikiness, and this volatility, it might be due to demand increases from things like EV charging. We're hearing about there being a lot more of there being a very substantial AI data center build out. So the interesting stat in the US is there's been more investment in AI data centers in the past 5 years than there has been investment in the entire interstate highway network in the US from the time from the time it was built until now, inflation adjusted. So there's a lot of energy demand from that, at least in the US. And obviously, a lot of weather-related usage spikes recently as summers sometimes get hotter and weather changes unpredictably. So yeah, even as electricity prices aren't necessarily trending upwards, they are becoming a bit less predictable, and that makes longer term budgeting a bit harder. And this is something that we're going to continue to track going forward. The next slide I have here is on contract service costs. And I think this is an area that a lot of boards feel, a bit more directly. And contract services, this is things like cleaning, maintenance, security, and management increased by about 3.9% in 2025. And what I believe is this is largely a labor story. So even though wages have cooled a little bit since the pandemic highs, labor is still hard to find. It is more expensive and it is more regulated than it has been in the past. So those might be reasons why we continue to see elevated increase in contract service costs. But one thing to also maybe keep in mind is that many service providers may have also held back on increases in prior years, while things like insurance and utilities and reserve funds spiked. And it's also possible that now we're seeing some of that catch up happening with contract service costs here. The next slide I have here is on management fees, and this is a component of contract service costs. So we saw that in 2025, management fees increased by about 3.3% on average. That's a bit lower than some of the other categories, but it's still significant. And this really reflects what is happening in the condo industry, as every property manager here knows. There is a shortage of experienced property managers. And what does that really mean? That means there's usually more training involved and there's higher recruitment costs. And maybe it also means there's wage pressures from those managers who are more experienced. And those are some of the things that might drive up management fees. There's also higher regulatory and compliance expectations. Everyone here knows that, 5 years ago, there wasn't the CAT. Things like, certain activities in the CMREO and CAO were not there. So there just seems to be a bit more regulatory effort required, and that will naturally add costs to management companies that they might transmit over to the end client. And obviously, this job has become harder over the past several years and over time. I hear regularly from managers that the demands from owners have changed over time. There's just more complexity to operating a condo nowadays than in the past. And obviously, Simply put, if a job gets harder, then the cost of delivering that professional service generally goes up as well. And I think that's why we're seeing some increases in management fees in our budgets. So with that, the next slide, and this is our final slide, it's on insurance costs, and this is one of the bright spots that we saw in budgets in 2025. So we saw that insurance premiums declined by 11.7% in 2025, and this continues the easing that we saw in 2024. And this is after several years of very painful increases in insurance premiums that many managers here experience. It started in about 2018, where we started seeing double-digit percentage increases in insurance premiums. And what really, I think what we're really seeing here is the insurance cycle. I think in the teens we saw in the 2010s we saw insurance claims rise, and with that we probably started to see insurance underwriting standards increase. We might have seen some insurance providers leaving the space, leading to less competition and therefore higher premiums. I think we're seeing somewhat of a reversal now. Insurance providers might have started to see the industry begin to get more profitable lately. More insurance providers coming in, and therefore a bit more competition, leading to lower insurance premiums. So what we're seeing here is probably not a permanent reset, and it's more just like a normalization of what was previously a very hard market. And so while this relief, it's extremely welcoming to condos, it's not something that boards should expect will continue indefinitely. So that concludes that presentation. And just in summary, I guess, if you zoom out and you look at all this together, there's a few things that become, very clear. One is that condo fees are still rising, but at a more moderate pace, thankfully. Reserve funding remains one of the biggest long-term pressures on condo fees as reserve funds catch up to the increased prices of repair and replacements in the building. Um, Labor and service costs are still structurally higher, so that's contributing to an increase in condo fee growth. But thankfully, this past year we did see more relief coming from insurance and gas, so that's been very helpful for condos. And because of all these moving parts within a budget, what we always convey is that communication with owners has never been more important. And that's a perfect segue actually into our panel discussion, because the real question isn't just like, what the numbers are, which I've talked about here, but how are boards and managers dealing with them in practice? So I just want to thank all the managers that have stuck around. There's 434 managers in attendance right now. So I'm going to shift gears and we're going to get some real world perspective from our panel. And as I mentioned earlier, we are joined from by Tracy Hernandez, a property manager working directly with boards every single day. We are joined by Jan Kundakci, who is a condo auditor, and Luis Hernandez. Also, I should mention Luis Hernandez, Tracy Hernandez, unrelated, same last name, but they are unrelated. I tried to create as much confusion as possible by doing that. So I apologize to everyone. And Luis Hernandez, a condo lawyer. So all three of you see these issues every single day and you see it from different angles. So I think this is going to be a great conversation. So maybe we'll start off with just like initial reactions to the data. You've all seen the data. What stood out to you guys most in this year's report? Either something that surprised you or something that really confirmed what you've been seeing on the ground. Tracy, maybe I'll start off with you. You're the closest to the day-to-day realities of boards and owners. So what jumped out at you the most?
Thank you, Anthony. First, thank you for having me again. It's great to see that Condonexus is gathering this info and making it available to managers and boards. This type of transparency is valuable for understanding the financial pressures that we all face, communities face. What stood out for me mostly in this report was the increase to reserve fund contributions. It appears to be the largest driver of the fee increases across our portfolios. New developments typically have higher reserve fund contributions in their earlier years, the first 3 years, as they work toward meeting the long-term funding requirements. Reserve funds are usually underfunded when they're passed over to the homeowners. At the same time, older buildings are now experiencing the rising contributions due to escalating cost of goods and materials and services, which you mentioned in your presentation. And these pressures are pushing the reserve fund studies to recommend higher annual contributions to ensure that all the future repairs and replacement projects remain funded. Um, so this information really provides understanding of the importance of the proactive planning and ongoing communication with the owners and boards so that they understand why these increases are happening and what it's for.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jan, from an audit and financial perspective, did anything in the data surprise you, or did it largely confirm what you've been seeing as well?
Yeah, and mainly confirm what we're seeing. No real surprises, kind of what you presented. Just wanted to point out a few things. Insurance is cyclical, so it's gone down now. It's going to go back up, so you
Oh,
got to
yeah.
keep that in mind, and really know when and manager claims. Really know when to put a claim through and when not to. A lot more corporations are self-insuring now. Deductibles are really high. I mean, they start at $25,000. The industry says 2 to 3 times your deductible is when to put in a claim. So really understand that aspect of it. And what we saw, and it's kind of reflected in the high reserve fund now, is that reserve fund projects were being delayed because of the high costs. So people thought, oh, I'll push it to the future, I'll push it to the future. And now that inflation has come down, they go to revisit it, and the costs are still high. Kind of to Anthony's report, it did not go down. I mean, if you look at the average, the 5 year average is still high. Current inflation may be low, but those jobs still have to happen, and they're still going to be at a larger cost than they were back, a few years ago. So I think for the most part, kind of confirms what we're seeing, and the importance of really addressing these issues because it's pretty widespread.
It is very widespread. There's a question in the chat about reserve funds being underfunded over the past few years. And they asked, can you give an estimate of the number of condos that have experienced this? And I would say that the vast majority of condos have seen reserve fund increases because it only makes logical sense, when replacement costs increase by, let's say, 75%. Reserve fund contributions are going to have to make up for that. Somebody's going to have to pay for that. So naturally, those costs are going to go up in a condo. So to answer the question in the chat, the vast majority of condos, at least in our report, and maybe Jan, if you can confirm, have experienced that spike in reserve fund contributions.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that I think that reserve funds are underfunded to begin with from the start. So, given that the costs have gone up, we're seeing it more and more. We're seeing uh, higher costs, higher projected costs for future reserve fund projects, and even the engineers obviously are putting in a little bit higher numbers in there. We've seen them. Some corporations have gone back and redone their reserve fund studies to get a better
Mhm.
idea of it. So it's definitely happening. It is a reality, and again, it's happening throughout the industry.
Absolutely. And Luis, did anything in the report stand out to you as particularly significant? Oh, you're muted right now. Let me help you there.
There's always one of
You,
us.
it's amazing. It's been 5 years and that still happens. Um, there's nothing of particular significance. I'm kind of with Jan that it, for the most part, it confirmed most of what I knew. But what did stand out slightly to me was the management fees, in particular because of your last paragraph in the presentation, which is management firms are experiencing higher internal costs, including wages, benefits, technology investments. And yet, I found it striking that the fees have remained relatively consistent in the last few years in terms of rate of increase, um, which I think to me just kind of reinforced the cost sensitivity of condominiums and where they're being squeezed and where they're not. And I found it remarkable that amid all of those issues, the shortages, et cetera, you're still seeing kind of a consistent 3% year over year. So I thought it was amazing.
Yeah, that's definitely been an industry-wide argument. Well, there is the argument that condominium managers are sometimes, or the management companies or fees are sometimes lower than expected, given all of these changes. So definitely, thanks for pointing that out. Um, so the next topic I want to jump into is how are boards reacting to these increases? So, are they more understanding than in past years, or are they like more resistant? To put another way, do you feel like there's more acceptance now that costs are structurally higher, or are boards still struggling with like the sticker shock of these big increases? And Tracy, you're the one delivering this message very often. So how do you see boards responding?
I mean, boards are rarely pleased with fee increases under any circumstances. However, overall, the budget meetings that I've been part of, the board meetings that I've been a part of, overall, I feel like they're much more understanding. I think a lot has changed in the last few years, and a lot of boards work closely with the teams, the management teams, throughout the entire year, month to month. So they do have a more clear picture of the financial position before we get to the budget process. They see, like I said, the monthly financials, and they understand the pressures that are being put on the operating and reserve funding. Um, and most boards do understand the increases are tied to a very carefully prepared budget. So once we take them through that budget and go line by line and explain where the increases are coming from and why it's necessary, they're usually pretty understanding. The hard part is explaining that to all the owners in the building the same way. I mean, it's much easier to have a board understand and accept it than it is to have the hundreds of the owners in the building feel the same way. But it definitely helps to educate your board, inform your board, have them be part of the process, so that they can help explain that going forward. It's better if they understand it as well. But yes, overall, I do see and feel that the boards are more understanding with the fee increases.
Yeah, that's really positive to hear, especially since the increases a few years ago really came as a surprise to
Mhm.
many board members and owners, and a lot of them just really didn't understand why it was happening. But I do feel like the inflation that we saw in past years has become more normalized in the psyches of our condominium community. So it's good to hear what you're seeing on the ground there, Tracy. And maybe from a legal standpoint, I'll throw this one at Luis, and maybe I'll throw it at Jan as well. Do you guys see do like do the rising costs change the types of disputes or issues you're seeing from boards and owners? Like, are you seeing more challenges to budgets, maybe more pushback to special assessments, or more scrutiny to spending decisions? So Luis, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I think across the board, yes. Um, I think for the middle question, more pushback on special assessments. I've never not seen pushback on special assessments, to be honest with you. But um, what I'm seeing is, apart from disputes, I'm finding that there's a lot more lien work. We're seeing owners defaulting on their common expenses, people who are struggling with the rising costs. But in terms of, challenges to budgets and spending decisions, absolutely. We see it all the time. Just last week, I was at a requisition meeting where the requisition meeting was actually brought by one of the, we'll call them the minority directors, one on a five-person board. They were one of two, and they brought the requisition. because they felt that the board wasn't doing enough to keep fees low. And, they weren't necessarily selecting the cheapest contractor. They were making decisions that, you know, typically would be seen as reasonable, but you had this one director who wanted to push the narrative that you could keep fees low, not increase them, in fact, even reduce the fees. And you had a majority board that was trying to do the fiscally responsible thing, um, but having a real difficult conversation, both with the ownership, but internally with the board to say, we need to make these tough decisions for the long term health of the corporation. So definitely seeing a lot of that and a lot of scrutiny by owners. I'm sure Jan can speak to this, but when I'm chairing AGMs, I'm seeing a lot more questions to the auditors about certain spending and perhaps some of the reasons why. So Jan, I'll let you kind of run with it there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we have, the boards trying to do what they need to do, but yeah, the owners are more involved. The owners are asking a lot more questions in these AGMs than prior years because they're concerned. Everybody's concerned. There's lots of, um, issues with costs, and what it comes down to, what we're seeing is boards are trying to put. We get a lot of questions on: is this reserve fund eligible? Can I put this to the reserve fund? Their operating costs are going up, and they're trying to find ways to pretty much minimize that increase. And we really recommend against it for many reasons, but the main two are essentially you're depleting your funds that are meant for future projects. So you're going to bring that down early, and it's a contravention of the Condo Act. Again, remember your duties as the board. I mean, your job is not to help the condo reduce the fees. I mean, obviously you do your best, but that's not your mandate. Is that, you have to do what's good for the corporation itself, and reducing the fees is not always the right answer. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're also responding to board members. You really have to understand the corporation and its financials. Like, good boards are taking the time to do deep dives into their financials, understanding where the costs are being spent, reviewing discretionary expenditures, reviewing and tendering major projects and contracts. I mean, they're regularly visiting their budgets when needed. It's not a document you prepare and then review next year. I mean, you have to really go through this. You have to really assess it, adjust. You have to be on your toes. If something comes up, you have to be able to say, okay, you know what, we have to deal with that, but what else can we push, if anything? And lean on the professionals. The Condo Act says you have to do an engineer report every 3 years, but if something's coming up, or if you're having issues with a certain project, or sorry, certain area on the common elements, bring in your engineers, do a study on that specific area. You tackle these. If you're fiscally responsible, you're on top of the numbers. You tackle this early. It's really going to help address these rising costs when they do come up, because you'll have an answer to them, and it'll show that you're proactive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key thing you said there was like, it's not a manager's job to keep condo fees low or decrease condo fees per se. The manager's job is to manage the condo, and sometimes that requires increasing condo fees, especially to fund major repairs and replacements. I think one of the worst case scenarios is if you do have an upcoming major repair or replacement coming up, and if you do not have the funding for that, well, that could potentially be a bigger problem. So the next topic I have here to discuss is the importance of communication, because that's really important when communicating these condo fee increases. So how important is communication right now? Like, are you seeing a big difference when boards proactively explain why condo fees are rising versus maybe just like simply issuing a budget? So Jan, from an audit perspective, how do you see good communication translating into maybe fewer problems down the line?
Yeah, as I mentioned, you got to do all this stuff in the background, and definitely communicate. I can't stress the importance of effective and timely communication. Like, owners are stressed out more than ever, we feel. All they hear about nowadays is like inflation, cost of living pressures, the condo market volatility nowadays, interest rate uncertainty. We got the tariffs. So there's a lot going on. And you have to remember, these owners are all feeling this. So if an increase is needed, explain the owners why the increase is needed, but also the effects of not increasing it. You have to explain the effects that deferring a project and what that means. Bring external parties, bring in the engineers when a large reserve fund project is needed. There's some comfort when it comes from a third party, and it also gives you the owners the opportunity to ask them questions. So it's not always, the board or the directors telling us we need to do this. You're showing that you have third parties who were consulted to bring this opinion to you, and give owners notice in advance. Hold town halls, avoid surprises. Essentially, the board should take measures such as the ones identified, essentially to give owners reassurance that the board is being diligent. The owners want to know that they're being dealt, and essentially you're building trust with these owners.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tracy, what have you seen work well when managers explain increases to owners, and what maybe tends to backfire? I'd love to get your perspective on that.
So communication's absolutely essential, and we're seeing more and more owners and board members wanting to be involved and wanting to understand, which probably comes from the past few years of large increases. So now they're more interested in what's going on. It's difficult for owners when they're struggling. Some are struggling to make their mortgage payments, and then they get a 10% fee increase, and that's a lot for them. So they don't necessarily in that moment want to understand what is causing the increase. They just see the bottom line. They just see the number that they have to pay more of every single month. So communication goes a long way in getting ahead of it. Jan, you brought up a good point about um, in advance letting them know. Sometimes that's difficult, we know, as property managers and board members, because we're waiting for numbers to come in. We're waiting for our 9, 10 month numbers, and then the boards have to go through it, and that all takes time. But I'm finding it goes a long way, and a lot of buildings are doing this now where they're holding info meetings. And info meetings allow owners not to be part of the decision. The decision's been made, the budget's been set, but to explain it to the owners. So if we can go line by line, and just explain, like, contracts are set, we go to tender, we get you the best possible pricing, and then how utilities are estimated, what the fee increases on Enbridge gas is going to be, what the expected increase, how often in a year do they increase? I know some utilities it's once, some utilities it's twice, and explaining all those things to them. And I think that goes a long way when owners have the opportunity to attend those meetings and comprehend how the budget is actually done and where the increases are coming from.
Absolutely. Going beyond just communicating and holding a town hall does seem to go a long way in terms of reassuring the owners and really explaining to them why increases are happening if they are. And so maybe just to wrap up the this portion about communication, maybe I thought I'd get Luis's perspective on the importance of communication as well when it comes to budget increases. So, Luis, do you have any perspective to share there?
Absolutely. Just a final component. I'm going to kind of tie it back to the legal side of things. The Condo Act is pretty good at setting minimum communication requirements. You have to send out your notices of meeting. You have to send out your PICs and your ICUs anytime that there's any changes. But I think the key component is, even though that is a very good system that's been built in, you have to go above and beyond. If you want owners to truly understand, you need to do additional communications. You need to send out budgets well in advance. You need to do town halls like Tracy suggested, which I have found are actually extremely useful. But ultimately, just go above and beyond. There's really, and you can be very creative with communication. So I think it is something that's vital to help owners understand, but more importantly, help owners feel heard, because I think sometimes they just need a place to vent their frustration. They have nowhere else. This is a cost that's imposed upon them. And at the very least, they want to be heard and be able to give their 2 cents on the situation and perhaps how it could be improved.
Yeah, and it goes back to sort of what Tracy said earlier, condo fees are just a part of the growing set of costs that owners across Ontario are experiencing. We're seeing inflation across all different types of categories, from food to mortgage costs. So just seeing another one, condo fees going up, it really affects them. So communicating that and being empathetic while we communicate as well is very important. One of the last topics that I have here on the docket is handling operating surpluses. As mentioned earlier, in this webinar, we did see some components of the budget ease in terms of costs, specifically insurance and gas. And that might have actually helped some condos see some operating surpluses. So I guess my question to the panel is, how do you typically advise boards when handling surpluses? Like, do you usually recommend that they return the fund to owners? Do you recommend that they apply them to future budgets, or do you recommend something like allocating the surpluses to reserve or contingency? And maybe we'll start with Jan here. So Jan, what's the accounting and tax angle here?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we're not seeing it as much nowadays, but
Yeah.
there are surpluses. If one exists, we caution against just applying that full surplus to the next year's budget. You want to keep that. You remember the operating fund is essentially a cushion for anything in the future that comes up that's unexpected. So you still want to keep that in there. Second thing is when you start reducing fees a lot, it sets some expectations. So you don't want to do that all the time too. What we notice or what we recommend in these situations is look at the surplus, see where it's needed. If your reserve fund maybe needs a top up, you can put it there. Um, Contingency fund's always a good option. We're seeing more and more people put it towards the contingency fund. Um, there's a lot of stuff happening nowadays, a lot of water damage we're hearing about, insurance premiums. Again, deductibles are up. So a lot of corporations, as I mentioned earlier, are self-insuring. So it gives you a tool to have this fund set aside for anything that will come up that's unexpected. And this can be spent on anything at the board, at the corporation's discretion. So it's a nice way to put money aside for anything in the future. I'll quickly touch on the tax side of it. Condos are not-for-profit organizations. You shouldn't be really building up a large surplus. The money's there to deal with day-to-day operations and a little bit as a cushion. If you start really building up a huge surplus, there could be tax consequences. So just wanted to keep that in mind. That's not the object. The objective of a condo is not meant to be to make profit, to earn profit. And if that accumulated surplus starts to really build up when we start reporting them on the tax return, because we have to put that number in there, you could flag some stuff on CRA's side. So again, you can play around with it a little in terms of reducing the fees, but just really understand your corporation, where the needs are in the future, and adjust it that way.
Absolutely. And continuing with the topic of handling operating surpluses, Luis, are there any legal considerations that the board should be aware of?
Definitely. And this is, again, an area where the Condo Act actually addresses it directly. So, Section 84(2) of the Condo Act deals specifically with what a common surplus is. And it really only gives you two options. It says you are either going to apply it to a future common expenses or you're going to pay it into the reserve fund. So the former basically means you're going to keep it in your operating, or you could potentially use it as a contingency. But then the alternative is to put it into your reserve fund. So what the Condo Act specifically prohibits is returning funds to owners. So it actually says in the language, it shall not be distributed to the owners or the mortgagees of the units. So if you ever have any directors or owners suggesting that because you have a surplus, you should just be sending out a check to everybody, you can point them straight to the act and tell them that that is just not something that's permissible. Um, and another consideration is that if you are putting it in the reserve fund, you have to remember that you're locking in those funds for only reserve fund expenditures, which means any major repair or replacements of the common elements. So if you are concerned about flexibility, then perhaps keeping it in the operating or having a contingency is much better than locking it into the reserve, especially if your reserve fund is already, meeting the expectations of the reserve fund study. So that's not to suggest that it's not a good idea to put it in there, but you are somewhat restricting the use of it by putting it in the reserve fund and locking it in, if you will.
Mhm. Absolutely. And maybe I'll throw it to Tracy as well from a practical perspective. What are you seeing boards doing when it comes? And again, we're not necessarily seeing as many surpluses nowadays as we have in the past. But what have you seen boards do when surpluses do arise?
So unfortunately, I have in the past year seen quite a few boards run into the depletion of their surplus that they applied in previous years, and then they're facing 20% increases. So as much as it's easy in the moment to be like, well, we have the surplus and we're looking at a 10% increase, so let's apply it and only increase by 1%. At some point that has to be made up. That gap has to be made up and spoken for. So we're finding that there are quite a few new developments. In the first, second year, there is a surplus. And then they're applying it and ending up having huge increases in the future. I just wanted to say throw it back to Jan, is there a limit? So if you're carrying a surplus, is there a limit, a line that will trigger the CRA?
No, I don't think that there's no dollar amount. They really assess if they were to audit you, they really kind of assess, the operations. If you have a consistent surplus year after year after year and it's growing, that may be an issue. But if it's fluctuating and the CRA sees it as a reason to just it's there as a contingency, and I don't think it should be a big deal. It's
Okay.
it's it's really these corporations, which again, we're not running into it nowadays. Is these really big surplus that are building up, and it's not an issue. But like that's kind of what they're looking at. There's no set number.
Yeah. So I think it's standard for us to recommend 1 to 3 months worth of maintenance fees as a surplus for safety because things happen. And like we mentioned earlier, with the weather changing, and this is the first year since 1999 that we've had this much snow in the month of January in 1 month. The freezing cold, like all these things trigger things to happen within condos. We were all holding our breath last weekend to make it through the weekend and see how many pipe bursts we had and floods and things like that. So with the extreme weather changes and the extreme political changes, it's best to be prepared for the unknown, what we don't know, and to carry a bit of a surplus is recommended because things can come up. Things are constantly changing.
Yeah, just to add to that, a lot in the industry say 1 to 3 months, and I think that's a good number still. But it really comes down to knowing your corporation. If you look at the past, 5 years, if you've been budgeting really well, you may be on the lower end. If you're not good at budgeting, you may want to even go higher than that. I mean, I think it's
Mhm.
really comes down, but I think that's a great guideline. And 1 to 3 months, and is usually what we're seeing in the industry.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we're nearing the end of the panel discussion before we move on to Q&A. So maybe we'll wrap up the panel discussion with just one piece of advice from each panelist. So if you had to give one piece of advice to a condo board or a property manager heading into their next budget cycle, what would it be? And maybe we'll start off with Jan.
Sure. I'd say probably have some sound financial plan. Come up with a 3 to 5 year strategy, including realistic predictions. Look at what needs to be accounted for during this period, reserve fund projects, common area enhancements. Even your regular day-to-day maintenance. Don't fall in the trap of being short-term focused. Many years ago, a lot of people did the LED retrofits. It costs a
Mhm.
lot, but they're noticing the savings now. So just come up with a long-term plan, revisit it, adjust it, and just yeah, stay away from again deferring projects with the objective of saving costs because again, it could cost you more in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tracy, would you have one piece of advice you'd like to share?
Yeah, I agree with Jan completely. I would encourage boards to take a thorough and very honest look at their financials and focus on protecting long-term health, not just the next coming year. Um, You want to have adequate funding so that the corporation doesn't end up in the deficit in 1 to 3 years ahead of time. Cost cutting can be, helpful, but it should never be at an expense of the essential services, and the financial well-being of the corporation. So yeah, I recommend that budgets are forecasted ahead of time and the boards look into the future long term.
Absolutely. And Luis, would you have one piece of advice that you'd like to share with Condoland about budgeting?
Well, I'll say Jan and Tracy kind of nailed it there, but if I had one small piece, it would be have the tough conversations. I feel like these are very difficult conversations to have. People don't want to hear that you need to have increases, and they don't want to hear that you need to be responsible and plan ahead. But at the end of the day, those tough conversations are for everyone's benefit. So um, you don't want to have to practice too much, but you need to be practiced enough to have them, and really work with your boards and your owners to build those communication plans and be able to get people on board because it's a very difficult thing to do.
Absolutely. One could say that property management is a lot about just, having a series of conversations, and the budget is definitely can sometimes be a challenging and a tough conversation, but it's one that's really needed. So with that, we have 5 minutes left. So we will try to jump into some Q&A with our expert guests. I've picked some questions. So there's one question here from M. Hikita, and they write, how are topics like decarbonization being broached to boards and owners? I know Jan mentioned LED projects earlier. There's a bunch of different, sustainability projects that a condo can do, high efficiency boilers, building automation systems, VFDs, etc. So Jan or anyone on the panel, how would you broach the conversation of decarbonization with a condo?
Um, I'll let maybe Tracy jump on that one in terms of the communication, but in terms of, I guess, what we're seeing is more corporations are looking into this and being more proactive in this. There's the TAF, forget what it stands, something.
Toronto Atmospheric Fund.
You're right. So they're paying up to 70% of the reserve fund study. So corporations are taking advantage of this. The reserve fund, the enhanced reserve fund study, I think it's called the enhanced reserve fund study. And we're noticing a lot more corporations are looking into it, being more proactive. But it's a big shock. They're noticing a lot more costs associated with what's expected to happen in the future. But I think communication is key. It kind of comes back to what we were saying before. I don't know if Tracy, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think it's important to provide information on cost saving and on retrofits and things like that, how to save money in the long term. But also cautionary, we need to be careful as property managers and boards that we're using reputable companies and that we're looking at the information they're providing and whether it will in fact be beneficial in the future. Because some can promise a lot and you don't see much savings coming back to you. So it's important to fully educate your boards and research and know what you're recommending and what you're discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. The reputation of the provider is so important.
Yeah.
Every provider is going to make claims that seem amazing, but it's important for property managers to vet them. So we maybe have time for one more question, and there's a theme of questions that I'm seeing here about town halls and how they can be challenging, especially if you let people vent about budgets. So questions from Christine Dade, from um, I see Gary Wine also commented about that. So I'm wondering, does the panel have any advice for holding town halls to discuss budgets and condo fee increases? Luis, you might have even chaired some of those. So maybe Luis, would you happen to have any advice for holding town halls to discuss these matters?
Yes, I've definitely shared quite a number of them. And if I were to distill the advice, it'd be know your community. If you have a cooperative community that can show up to their party room and have a civilized discussion, then by all means, have it in person. You might not even need to invite a lawyer, and you can have your manager or your board president handle the meeting. If you have a bit of a more contentious audience, that's maybe when you bring in some of the experts to come in and uh, bring in a senior level property manager or bring in a lawyer or something like that to help out. But also understand your community in that for a town hall, because it doesn't have the same formal requirements, you can make it a Zoom meeting, right? You can hire a company like Condonexus and have a webinar. And, when you're doing a virtual town hall, there's a lot of advantages to it, right? You can have as many people pop in and pop out. You don't have outbursts. You can sort of control the flow of the conversation. If you have to present numbers, this is a thing that the auditors do extremely well is they pull up their budgets and their audited financial statements and they show everything on the screen well zoomed in. So um, this all kind of stems from knowing your community, but there's many ways that you can manage a town hall meeting in a way that's going to be respectful and informative instead of becoming toxic, right?
Mhm.
So, um, but if you have to, there are experts that can come in and ideally help control that meeting. And if it doesn't work, then don't do it and send it out by
Mhm.
way of a notice or communication. A town hall meeting might not be the right solution for every place, but I will say I have found it to be a very useful forum for people to both express their frustrations and their concerns, and also for boards and managers to communicate.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
agree 100% with you, Luis. It's you got to know your community, right? You know your community best as a property manager and as a board, and you know what will be best. So if you have a pretty chill community in person, could be the way to go, but it's more controlled when you have a Zoom meeting or even have a host like Condonexus. And also presentation goes a long way. So if you can do a PowerPoint that explains everything and gives a visual, it goes a long way. And then opening up for Q&A at the end is great. And if you have a contentious population, then having somebody there like Luis to chair it and to control it goes a really long way.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know I said that would be the final question, but there was one interesting question that did pop up. I know it is 12 o'clock now, so if any managers have to leave for another arrangement, certainly feel free. But we'll just do this one final question, then I'll wrap it up. This question comes from Ryan Chatwin, and this is very relevant. Ryan asks, can reserve funds be used for unplanned significant snow removal as preventative maintenance to avoid roof leaks or ice damming? So snow is a very relevant topic right now. So I don't know if either Luis or Jan have anything to say about this.
Luis, you
I
want to give
like
a
how we're
short?
playing a game of we're playing
Yeah.
a game of chicken here. Um, my immediate impulse is to say no. I don't see that as being a major repair or replacement within the meaning of the Condo Act. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that. Jen?
Yeah, I'm the same. Yeah, I just go back to the definition, and I know you're doing preventative maintenance to maybe avoid an issue, but maintenance is not reserve fund eligible.
Perfect. Thanks for that. So it is 12:02 now. I do thank everyone who joined us for this presentation. There's about 450 property managers out there that joined this at this late morning. I definitely want to thank our three panelists, Luis Hernandez, Tracy Hernandez, and Jan Kundakci, for joining us as well. Your insights were super valuable and helpful. And I just want to share again that our 2026 Condo Fee Trends Report is available online. I will be sending an email after this webinar later in the afternoon with a certificate of completion and a link to the report as well. So look out for that in your inbox and definitely claim your 1.0 CPE credit. So again, thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks to the panelists, and I guess until next time, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
everyone.
much, everyone.